So in the mid-1960s, we have a situation called the Great Society. And we have President Lyndon Johnson, who got his start in politics during the New Deal with Franklin Roosevelt, remember, where we saw Roosevelt put into place a whole bunch of programs to try to ease the Great Depression and then offer relief, recovery, and reform. Here we have Lyndon Johnson, who was highly influenced by that situation in the 30s and 40s, and he's now president. As such, he sees government as having an opportunity to solve major social problems in America. As such, he launches these programs to try to deal with race, to try to ease poverty in the United States, to improve education, and to provide some basic health care, both for the elderly, but then also for people who can't afford that. So what we want you to do here is we want you to go ahead and take a look at the link at the Great Society, and we want you to start to consider a little bit what this list suggests about the government's ability to solve these problems.
And so the real question is, what is the role of the government? Should it be to solve every problem that our nation has and create all these programs to do so? Or is it individuals who have these ideas and do that privately? I mean, there's a debate in our country over that. So you have to think about that. You have to answer that question, looking at the link and looking at these things.
And one final thing to consider here is that traditionally the United States government has answered that as you have to find a balance between government help and individual or private organizations. So one thing you might want to do is consider, where would you find that balance?
Now we have a more recent expansion of power from a few more recent presidents. We have Reagan, George W. Bush, and President Obama, who currently is in office. So we kind of see examples of conservative and liberal presidents and basically how they have expanded the role of government. If you look at President Reagan, we have some things where he literally would not allow air traffic controllers to strike and fires them all for doing so, which set a little bit of a new precedent. We got George W. Bush passing the Patriot Act after 9/11, creating the Department of Homeland Security. Some would say, through the Patriot Act, which expanded government surveillance, basically whoever they choose, they can really look at whoever they want. There's no check or balance necessarily there. And then President Obama, obviously with the new health care reforms and the Affordable Care Act, further expanding the role of government, obviously into the health care system. So what we'd like you to do here is answer the question, what does that suggest about government's ability to solve problems? Again, looking at the whole idea of, is this the right thing for the government to do? And obviously this is a more modern, more recent examples of those things.
So that last slide just blew Hansoehlsen's head, so he can't say anything right now. But
struggling a little bit, everybody.
What I need you to do is I need you to click on this link that's listed there at Answer Garden. You're going to go to it and you're going to create a 4-word summary about the expansion of government. In other words, we want you to just take a minute and think about all this stuff that you've heard us tell you about and pick 4 words that you think best describe the 20th century expansion of government.
True that.
So one of the other aspects of democracy and government that you learned about on your stations activity is, of course, corruption. Now, the United States traditionally has not been near as corrupt as some other places in the world. However, we've sure had our share as well, even in the 20th century. A couple of places where we see this as examples is, of course, the political machines. What these basically were was they were conspiracies of a sort between party bosses or government bosses and his or her supporters. Usually it was a his, of course, in the early 20th century. Probably the most famous and well known is in Tammany Hall, New York, from the mid 1800s all the way through the 1940s, where you had basically people giving government huge amounts of money for favors, and vice versa. You would have government give certain contracts to people and would run up the bill so that the taxpayers paid a large bill, and the extra money would go into the pockets of the bosses.
Biggest name to understand from Tammany Hall is a guy named Boss Tweed. They would actually fix elections a little bit. They would get their political candidate elected again by doing favors for people in exchange for their vote.
In the both in the 20s and the 1940s and 50s, we also saw something called the Red Scares. And whether or not this is corruption is, I don't know if that's the best term for it, but what you do have is you have unwarranted persecution of some American citizens for fear of them being communist. You even have a committee in Congress called the House Un-American Activities Committee, whose job it was to look into Americans who might sympathize with communists.
And that's the second Red Scare. Okay, that was in the more in the 50s, 40s, and 50s. Okay, after World War II. So in the 20s, we have all these immigrants coming into our country, many of them from Russia, and so there's this fear that they'll bring in those communist ideas with them. And some of the things we did was we deported. We had raids, and we literally kicked people out of the country we thought might be communists and radicals, right? Then after World War II, we have the Soviet Union. They're communist, so we're afraid of infiltration in our government and even in our military. A guy named Joseph McCarthy, who was a senator from Wisconsin, thank you very much, he was accusing people in our government and in our military, that's what's got him in trouble, of being communist, and affected his life. He ends up drinking himself to death after it's found out that he's kind of defrauding these people.
Now, whether or not corruption is the best word for this, I'm not really sure. However, one thing we do know you have going on here is people's freedom of speech and freedom of association being infringed upon here with some of these government organizations.
Losing their jobs, being marked, blacklisted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So then probably moving on, the most famous version of corruption at the highest levels in American government is the Watergate scandal, when in 1974 President Richard M. Nixon resigns the presidency, the only president ever to do this. So this is a huge, big
monumental
deal.
Yeah.
Now he resigns before he's found guilty of anything. He resigns before he's impeached. And he resigns not for causing a burglary, but for being involved in a cover-up of a burglary.
A burglary.
Burglary.
Nothing to do with hamburgers.
Nothing to do with hamburglers.
All right, so when you're done with this slide, we just want to make sure you're aware of what we expect now. You're going to go back into these next two slides and click on at least three links, and you're going to basically use the space then to the right of your notes guide and think about thinking like an historian, things that we presented to you, a couple of those different ways to think like a historian. We're going to use changing continuity. And we want to discuss corruption in American government, okay? So we want to think about what has changed and what has stayed the same. So things that you see today that is kind of maybe either changed or stayed the same.
Again, on this slide, then, what we have are some more recent examples of what are largely considered to be some corrupt behaviors in government, starting with the Iran-Contra affair while Ronald Reagan was president. Basically, long story short, basically what you have is the United States selling arms to Iran, an enemy country, to support a anti-government movement in Nicaragua, where Congress had already told the executive branch that they could not do this. And so you have this idea of the branches not really knowing what the other branches are doing, and in the process, perhaps some laws were broken. The Clinton-Lewinsky affair, Handsome wants to tell you about.
Well, Bill Clinton had been
He's a little-
riddled with women coming out even before he was president, saying things that had happened between him and them.
He was a ladies' man.
He was a ladies' man. Okay, so he liked ladies, even though he was married. He liked other women too. And so while he was president of the United States, it came out that he had an inappropriate relationship with an intern that worked at the White House,
Named Monica Lewinsky.
Monica Lewinsky. And under oath, he had said that he did not have sexual relations with that woman. Well, technically, if you're using semantics, he was meaning he did not engage in sexual intercourse.
The famous line that comes from all of this is not because it would be illegal for him to have an affair as president, but they were concerned about perjury, which is lying under oath. And so the famous line that came out of this when President Clinton was being deposed, which means he was being asked a bunch of questions by the prosecutors, his famous line was, "It depends on what the meaning of the word is." So I only bring that up because we have a very slippery and unclear sort of understanding of exactly what happened, and we have some political and argumentative maneuvering that basically allows Clinton to stay in office. And the question that arises is, to what extent do our political leaders need to be moral role models?
And then finally, we see the Citizens United thing at the bottom here, our last little bit that we have for you.
Citizens United was a major case that went all the way to the Supreme Court in 2010. And again, basically what this is about is whether or not, the question is how much can people contribute to a political campaign while people are running for office. And basically what Citizens United has done is it's kind of blown off the doors and allowed organizations and contributors to contribute as much money as they could possibly want. And this concerns a number of people because a number of people think that perhaps this means that elections can be bought.
Now you can see that we have civil rights on here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some things about civil rights. You can see the question at the top: has the democratic experience in the 20th century America been the same for everyone? Also, things that we've talked about a little bit already in this class. So we're kind of focusing in on women and women's right to vote. That's what suffrage means, women's suffrage there at the bottom, and also Black American civil rights and what that looks like and how they have gotten them, or do they really have them, that whole idea.
What we want you to do here is we want you to go a little bit deeper than maybe you have before and explore these two links a little bit so you can understand more what was similar and what was different about this experience for women and African Americans. And what you really have are two examples of how the democratic experience has been different for different people.
So now that you just compared women's suffrage with Black Americans and the difference between what the women went through and what Black Americans went through, now that we got to remind you there's other groups that were fighting for rights and trying to earn that equality. You can see here we got the Chicano youth movement, American Indians, Asian Americans, feminists, disabled Americans, and obviously our LGBTQ groups. We also want to make sure that you understand that some of them have had issues with voting and whatnot. So now we want you to do kind of the same type of thing. We want you to click on two links here as well. You have a little bit more to choose from, a little bit more freedom to choose from. And we want you to think about and answer the question, what do you learn about being a minority in America? Okay. Then we move to the conservative movement of the 70s into today. We had Ronald Reagan. This was kind of, again, a response to some of the civil rights movement and anti-war movement. But the big thing here is this the conservative approach, like religious, moral, and financial approach to the country, to government, and actually shrinking government a little bit. It's too big, too many programs, too much money being spent, although we're going to see more money being spent on military. And here's some other presidential approaches through the 1900s. We want you to look at one of them that you feel had the biggest impact and respond to that. I think we just want you to turn and talk and have a conversation with someone next to you how the government's changed over time.